Good evening, everyone. I would like to wish you a warm Scottish welcome to the 10th, I hope it's the 10th, Women's Place UK webinar. Can I just thank everyone for coming tonight? It's a great turnout so far and reflects the wonderful support that you and many other women have given Women's Place UK since it was established 5 years ago. Thank you. My name is Susan Dalgety. You will notice I am not Professor Selina Todd, who unfortunately is suffering from COVID. We all hope she gets better soon, and I hope you will bear with me tonight as I try to do my best to take her place. I'm a writer for Scotland's national newspaper, The Scotsman, as well as our city paper, the Edinburgh Evening News. And I'm a women's rights campaigner here and in Malawi, in sub-Saharan Africa, where I've worked with the Women's Legal Resources Centre for more than a decade. And I'm a very doting granny, 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. The topic of tonight's discussion is work and service provision for women. And while the speakers will touch on the wider issues affecting us all, they will focus on the impact of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill that is currently going through the Scottish Parliament. And we will consider work in its widest sense, not just in the formal workplace. As we all know, women's work is much more than paid employment. We have 4 wonderful speakers, each expert in their field, but also 4 of the most prominent women's rights campaigners in the country. We have Pragna Patel, Shireen Benjamin, Anne Henderson and Lucy Hunter-Blackburn. I will introduce them more fully when they come to speak. So just a reminder, in case anyone needs one, that the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, if enacted in law, will allow anyone over the age of 16 in Scotland to change their legal sex simply by registering with the National Records of Scotland. It's self-ID. There are many implications for women's rights at stake here, from equal pay to safe single spaces. Yet the Scottish Government has consistently refused to engage properly with the women of Scotland on this issue. The general principles of the bill are due to be considered in Parliament soon, and it is highly likely that it will proceed to stage 2 with self-ID still firmly in place. Tonight, our panellists will discuss the implication of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill and self-ID on the workplace and service provision. They will consider what effect self-ID will have on sex discrimination and the Equality Act. They will also consider how it will affect quotas, parity schemes, role modelling. And we will hear from at least 2 of our speakers about their professional and personal experience of how academic freedom and the freedom to speak up at work has already been affected by the change in culture here in Scotland. Before I finish, with some housekeeping rules, can I remind you all that For Women Scotland have organised a women's rights rally on Thursday the 6th of October this week at 11:30 outside the Scottish Parliament. This is just a reminder for our elected politicians of the importance of women's rights. If you can, please join us, and I'll put the details in the chat. So, practical stuff. Each speaker will talk for 15 minutes, and after Lucy has finished, we will have a Q&A session. We have some questions already, but if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to sort it and answer as many as time allows. We're looking to finish at 8:30. The chat is open. I'm sure you'll all keep it respectful, but we do reserve the right to remove anyone who can't do that. Crucially, we're live tweeting the event, and the hashtag is WPUK is working. Only the panellists are recorded. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Pragna Patel, our first speaker. Pragna is the ex-director and founding member of the Southall Black Sisters and Women Against Fundamentalism. She will address, among many other issues, the conflicts of rights that gender recognition reform threatens, particularly for BME women. Pragna.
Thank you very much, A Woman's Place, for inviting me to this really much needed discussion on the consequences of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill and the proposals around gender self-identification, currently before the Scottish Parliament, as you mentioned in your introduction. I know that in Scotland things have moved quickly, but as many have pointed out, little attention has been paid to the contradictions and conflicts that will arise as a result. My presentation today will look at what gender reform means for the provision of women-only services, particularly those for Black and minority ethnic BME women, and secondly, the implications for the issue of freedom of speech for women. This is, of course, a fraught area of discussion, which has often been reduced to a simplistic clash between women's rights and trans rights. But it doesn't have to be this way. I want to stress at the outset that I fully support the right of all individuals to exercise self-determination in the way that they choose to live their lives and to express their identity free from coercion, discrimination, threats, and abuse. But that cannot and should not lead to the erasure of sex as a category. Historically, the struggle for women's rights have always focused on challenging oppression based on their biological sex. These struggles not only remain unfinished business, but they have in fact become even more urgent in the context of extreme right-wing and authoritarian political and neoliberal economic developments across the world. In country after country, from the US to Iran, authoritarian forces have singled out women's rights, but also paradoxically those of sexual minorities and other vulnerable groups for attack, compelling women and others to wage even greater struggles to regain their hard fought for rights in what are often life and death situations. In the UK, women are having to defend their rights in the face of an onslaught, not only from a right-wing state, but disturbingly from those who see themselves as part of the wider progressive movement for social justice. One consequence of this is the speed with which those arguing for trans rights have been able to capture institutions and push through policies and proposals for new laws around gender self-identification that have significant ramifications for women-only services. The current plans by the Scottish Government to reform the Gender Recognition Act has, amongst other things, the potential to erase critical safe spaces such as centres and refuges for vulnerable women and girls who on a daily basis face grave risks to their health and lives due to their experiences of domestic and sexual violence and other forms of sex-based oppression and discrimination. The right to women-only spaces has long been recognised in the Equality Act in the UK itself and in international human rights instruments such as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which allows for the provision of single-sex services in certain circumstances, for example, to support women subject to gender-based violence. In its concluding observations on the UK in 2019, CEDAW specifically stated that the government needed to ensure that the policy of commissioning services does not undermine the provision of specialised services for women who are victims of gender-based violence. And whilst the impact of the proposed gender recognition reforms means that all women will be severely affected, I want to focus specifically on the impact on BME women's services in particular, because that's my area of expertise. Over the years, my frontline experience has shown that BME women and girls are subject to systemic subjugation on the basis of their biological sex, which is maintained and legitimized through patriarchal power, embedded in the institutions of the family, religion, and community. In many cultures, a woman's destiny is mapped out the day she is born, and in some cases, for example, in South Asian cultures, the day while she's still in the womb. Female feticide or sex-selective abortion, female infanticide, FGM, polygamy, reproductive coercion, forced marriage, honor-based violence, and dowry-related violence are just some of the harms that are perpetrated on women and girls precisely because of their sex. And although progress has been made in some areas, BME women continue to face immense hardships and barriers in their struggle for equality. In 2016, for instance, Dame Louise Casey found that in isolated and deprived communities, the advances made towards gender equality in the country generally were not reflected in the lives of many Asian women. Evidence also shows that female suicide rates in Asian communities are, for example, higher than in the wider society because suicide is culturally more acceptable than exiting from abuse. In 2018, research cited in a report by the Croydon and Bromley Women's Aid noted that domestic abuse is a factor in 49% of suicides and self-harms attempts made by Black women, compared to 22% of suicide attempts made by white women. Other studies have shown that suicide rates amongst Asian women are up to 3 times the national average. Many BME women are also likely to be at greater risk of violence and harm, not only from intimate partners, but also multiple perpetrators due to the tight-knit structures of extended families and the wider kinship groups and communities in which they live. For example, 50% of BME female victims experience violence from multiple perpetrators, precisely because policing female behavior and meting out punishment is a collective act in which the boundaries of family and community are blurred. My experience and research have also shown that BME women remain trapped in violent relationships for longer than their white British counterparts and are more likely to be murdered by their husbands and family members than their white counterparts. Added to this, the complexities arising from reactionary developments that have seen the growing entrenchment of religious fundamentalist and ultra-conservative values in family and community structures. Right-wing religious forces have instituted dangerous patriarchal processes that serve to enhance the social control of women and to deny them access to legal and state welfare resources that are necessary for equality to be realized. In the light of all this, the provision of single-sex BME women's services staffed by women take on huge significance. These services are often an option of last resort for the majority of women, but precisely because of this, they need the safety and the privacy that these spaces give them to make sense of their experiences without fear of being hunted down, judged, blamed, or discriminated against. Such services are necessary and effective in providing a much needed lifeline and increasing women's safety, as well as confidence and independence. It is not possible, in my view, to challenge issues like violence against women and girls if we cannot assert that violence against women and girls is both a cause and consequence of women's inequality. That is why the principle of by and for services has been universally accepted as a core part of the struggle for female autonomy and equality. The vast majority of BME women are likely to feel compromised by the presence of trans women in women-only services. The consequence is that there will be even less options for women who are already both over and under policed by the state and who are subject to discriminatory community forms of dispute resolution that deny them access to justice. Criteria that make funding for violence against women and girls services conditional upon providing access to men who identify as women will have adverse consequences for vulnerable BME women. For reasons that I've already outlined, BME women's organizations are less likely to apply for funding if the criteria insists on the inclusion of trans women with or without gender recognition certificates. In addition, confusion and conflict will be created around the employment of female staff in women-only services and in the decisions made by frontline staff about who to allow access to such services and who to exclude, even in contexts where these organizations can apply the single-sex exemption under the equality law. Leading lawyers on discrimination law suggest that those who hold a gender recognition certificate but are denied access to single-sex services may be able to argue that they have been directly discriminated against because under the Equality Act, they are deemed to be legally female. The issue becomes significant because the numbers of people holding gender recognition certificates are likely to increase considerably under the Scottish Government's proposals. Defending legal claims of sex discrimination will be labour-intensive and time-consuming. Moreover, given that gender identity reforms have been driven by a highly organised and well-funded political movement, claims of sex discrimination are likely to be frequent. All of this will deter BME women's organisations from applying for funding, or it will add to the uncertainties and anxieties that they face in a context where they have already been disproportionately impacted by austerity and cuts to spending, and where they face increasing demands from desperate women, especially migrant women with complex immigration problems that no one else wants to address. This does not, however, mean that there should not be appropriate specialist services for trans persons. Indeed, I agree with the recommendation made by the Women's Resource Centre in respect of the UK's implementation of recommendations made by CEDAW in 2019, that where the protected characteristics of sex and gender reassignment conflict, a third space of service is required, underpinned by an ethos of led by and for, to meet the distinct needs of each protected group without violating the rights of either group. The government has until 2023 to report on its recommendations in respect of single-sex services, but it is difficult to know what it will say given the way things are going in Scotland. Also, I can't see how we can accurately collect data on the basis of sex without the existence of women-only services. The need for disaggregated data on sex in respect of all forms of gender-related harms within BME communities is critical for policy and legal reform. At present, there is no reliable or centralized data on BME women's experiences of violence, inequality, and discrimination across a range of areas. What little exists comes from specialist BME women's services themselves. Without the existence of BME single-sex services, we would know even less about the lives of BME women and would be severely hindered in our ability to effectively address the glaring and growing sex inequalities that they experience to ensure compliance with the public sector equalities duty. The other concern I have is that the move towards trans-inclusive women-only spaces will also seriously constrain women's freedom of speech. The struggle for female self-determination has necessitated the creation of single-sex spaces as key sites of feminist resistance. Such spaces are not only central to individual women who need access to support and counselling, they're also critical to raising consciousness amongst women so that they feel able to speak out without fear of retribution and to share socialized experiences of sex-based discrimination in order to campaign for change. As one Asian woman interviewed in a survey conducted by the Women's Resource Centre in London put it, "We have got the freedom to share. We can speak to each other on any topic. Asian women in this country can be trapped, restricted, and tortured by Asian men. Here, we can learn from each other. Everyone has got different problems in life, but we can walk away from these problems and take control of our lives." So historically, BME women-only spaces were set up by feminists in the face of enormous opposition and hostility from within their communities and in the face of discrimination and indifference from the state. They were set up to give voice to women who were otherwise marginalized and invisible in the public domain, and as a consequence have no power to influence law and policy on issues that affect them. Without women-only spaces, political struggles for equality by BME women in the UK, embodied in campaigns for better laws and policies and practices around issues such as domestic and sexual violence, forced and early marriage, domestic abuse-related suicides and homicides, FGM and honor-based violence would never have taken place. It is precisely because of women-only spaces that women have been able to come together, empower each other, and in solidarity wage campaigns to challenge unjust and discriminatory community practices and state policies that stifle their hopes, aspirations, and dreams. In conclusion, I just want to say that we're really already witness to a growing culture of gendered censorship, fostered by those who should be our allies in the fight for equality and justice for all. Feminists are attacked for saying that sex matters and for opposing self-identification, which is treated as hate speech. Women are cancelled, no-platformed, and banned for being feminist and for not centering trans women's views in their discourse. Ill thought through changes in the law will only legitimize such regressive politics and make it even harder for BME women in particular to speak out. Thank you very much.